At my aunt's elaborate dinner party, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and designer place settings, she looked me dead in the eye and declared, "You'll get nothing when I die, Sophia. Not a single penny." I smiled sweetly, took a sip of her expensive wine, and said absolutely nothing. What she didn't know was that I'd already changed her will 3 months ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whole thing started at Aunt Vivienne's annual charity gala at her mansion in Beacon Hill. She always threw these events to show off her wealth while pretending to care about causes she'd never actually supported with real money. The guest list was always the same collection of social climbers, distant relatives, and business associates who kissed her ring in hopes of staying in her good graces. I'd been attending these performances for 15 years, ever since my parents died and left me with nothing but debt and the responsibility of caring for my younger sister Emma. Vivienne never let me forget that she was the one with money. She'd funded my college education, helped with Emma's medical bills when she needed surgery, and occasionally threw money my way when things got desperate. But every dollar came with strings attached and a reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I was the poor niece who should be grateful for scraps from the table of her success. That night, I wore a simple black dress I'd bought at a discount store, while everyone else sparkled in designer gowns. Vivienne made sure to point this out to her friend Margaret during cocktail hour, loud enough for half the room to hear. She said I had such a practical sense of style that I really knew how to stretch a dollar. Margaret laughed like it was the funniest observation she'd ever heard, and I just smiled and nodded like I always did. The dinner conversation was the usual routine. Vivienne held court at the head of her mahogany table, telling stories about her latest real estate acquisitions and her recent trip to Monaco. She owned 17 properties across 3 states, including a penthouse in Manhattan that she visited maybe twice a year. Her investment portfolio was worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and she never hesitated to remind everyone of that fact. My cousin Bradley, Vivienne's golden child, was there with his new wife Celeste. He'd never worked a real job in his life, living off the trust fund Vivienne had set up for him when he turned 25. He spent his days playing golf and his nights at expensive restaurants, charging everything to credit cards that Vivienne paid off without question. Tonight, he was bragging about the yacht he was considering buying, asking Vivienne if she thought the 40-footer was too small or if he should go for something larger. She beamed at him like he'd just announced he was curing cancer. She told him he deserved the best, that he should never settle for anything less than perfection. Then she turned to me and asked what I thought about his yacht plans. I said it sounded lovely. And she laughed that particular laugh she reserved for when she wanted to make someone feel small. She said I probably couldn't even imagine what it would be like to own something so luxurious. That's when her friend Dorothy, a woman who'd inherited her late husband's pharmaceutical fortune, chimed in about inheritance planning. She was going on about how important it was to make sure your money went to the right people, the ones who would appreciate it and use it wisely. She said she'd been revising her own will recently, making sure every dollar was accounted for and every recipient was deserving. Vivienne's eyes lit up like she'd been waiting for this exact opening. She set down her wine glass and looked directly at me with that cold smile I knew meant trouble was coming. She said inheritance was indeed a serious matter, that money should go to family members who had proven themselves worthy of such responsibility. She talked about how some people in families understood the value of hard work and smart decisions, while others just expected handouts their entire lives. The table went quiet, except for the soft classical music playing in the background. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react to what was obviously a setup for public humiliation. Vivienne was just getting started. She said she'd been thinking a lot lately about her own legacy, about what kind of message she wanted to send with her final wishes. She wanted to make sure her fortune went to people who would honor her memory properly. Then she delivered the line she'd probably been rehearsing all week. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You'll get nothing when I die, Sophia. Not a single penny. I'm leaving everything to Bradley and the family foundation. At least I know it won't be wasted on clearance rack dresses and cheap apartments." The silence that followed was deafening. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably realizing even he thought she'd gone too far this time. Celeste studied her plate like it contained the secrets of the universe. Margaret and Dorothy exchanged glances that said they were storing this moment away for future gossip sessions. I felt that familiar burn in my chest, the same feeling I'd carried for years every time Vivienne reminded me of my place in her world. But this time, something was different. This time, I had a secret that changed everything. I took a slow sip of her wine, a bottle that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and smiled. Not the fake smile I usually wore at these events, but a real one. Because 3 months earlier, I'd discovered something that shifted the entire game. I worked as a paralegal at Morrison, Walsh & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston. My job was mundane most days, filing documents and preparing briefs for attorneys who barely acknowledged my existence. But it gave me access to legal databases and connections that most people could only dream of. That's how I learned that Vivienne's longtime attorney, Harold Pemberton, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. His family was quietly transitioning his clients to other lawyers in the firm, but Vivienne didn't know yet. She was traveling in Europe at the time, completely unaware that her legal affairs were being handled by someone whose mental faculties were declining rapidly. When Harold's replacement, Jessica Chen, took over his client's aisles, she needed someone familiar with estate planning to help organize the transition. My supervisor assigned me to assist her, which meant I had legitimate access to Vivienne's most private documents. Her will, her trust structures, her property deeds, everything was spread across my desk for weeks while we prepared the handover. That's when I saw exactly how much money we were talking about. Vivienne was worth $43 million. Her real estate alone was valued at over $20 million, and her investment accounts contained more money than I could have imagined. The will itself was a masterpiece of cruelty, written to maximize Bradley's inheritance while ensuring that Emma and I received nothing but a few pieces of jewelry and some outdated furniture. But here's what Vivienne didn't know about Harold's condition. In his confused state, he'd been signing documents without properly reviewing them. Jessica had discovered several estate documents that had been improperly executed, including powers of attorney that had been granted to people who shouldn't have had them.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
When she brought this to my attention as part of the file review, I realized an opportunity had presented itself. I spent weeks researching estate law, studying precedents and loopholes that could be exploited. I learned about something called a power of substitution, a rarely used legal mechanism that allows certain designated individuals to modify estate documents under specific circumstances. Harold had included such a provision in Vivienne's trust structure years ago, probably as a standard protective measure he added to all his wealthy clients' documents. The provision was buried deep in the legal language, written in a way that most people would never notice or understand. It allowed a designated family member to make changes to the will if the primary beneficiary was deemed unfit or if circumstances changed dramatically. Harold had listed me as the designated family member, probably because I was the only one who had ever shown any interest in understanding Vivienne's legal affairs. Using my access to the firm's resources and my knowledge of proper legal procedures, I prepared a codicil that completely restructured Vivienne's will. Instead of leaving everything to Bradley and the foundation, the new version left him a modest trust fund of $2 million and designated Emma and me as the primary beneficiaries of the remaining $41 million. I made sure every legal requirement was met, every signature was properly notarized, and every document was filed correctly. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. I wasn't stealing anything or forging documents. I was using a legal provision that Harold himself had created, executed through proper channels with legitimate authority. By the time Jessica took over the account, the changes were already in effect and properly documented in the court system. So when Vivienne sat there at her elegant dinner party table, surrounded by her sycophant friends and ungrateful son, telling me I'd get nothing when she died, I couldn't help but smile. She had no idea that her fortune was already mine in everything but name. All I had to do was wait for nature to take its course and keep my mouth shut until then.
I finished my wine, complimented her on the excellent vintage, and told her what a lovely evening it had been. Then I excused myself politely, thanked her for her hospitality, and drove home to my cheap apartment with the knowledge that I'd just won a game she didn't even know we were playing. The weeks following Vivienne's dinner party passed in blissful normalcy. I went to work every morning, processed legal documents, and came home to my modest apartment where Emma was finishing her final semester of nursing school. She had no idea what had transpired at the dinner or what was waiting for us in the future. I preferred it that way. Emma had always been the optimistic one, the sister who believed the best in people, even when they showed her their worst. She didn't need to carry the weight of what I'd done until it was absolutely necessary. My daily routine became almost meditative. I'd wake up, make coffee in my tiny kitchen, and review my work assignments for the day. Jessica Chen had officially taken over Harold Pemberton's client load, and she was meticulous about documentation. Every week, she'd request updates on various estate files, and every week I'd provide her with detailed reports that showed everything was in perfect order. The beauty of working within the legal system was that once documents were properly filed and processed, they became part of an official record that was very difficult to challenge. Vivienne, meanwhile, continued her life of luxury, completely unaware that her financial empire had shifted beneath her feet. She posted photos from her weekend getaway in the Hamptons, showing off her latest jewelry purchases and expensive wine collections. Bradley shared updates about his yacht shopping adventures, apparently having settled on a 50-foot model that cost more than most people's houses. Their social media feeds were a constant stream of excess and entitlement, a perfect documentation of exactly why they didn't deserve the fortune they thought was coming their way. About a month after the dinner party, I received an unexpected phone call at work. It was Vivienne's personal assistant, Rebecca, asking if I could help coordinate some legal documents for my aunt. Apparently, Vivienne wanted to review her estate planning and make some minor adjustments to her charitable giving provisions. Rebecca explained that Vivienne had been trying to reach Harold Pemberton, but his office kept transferring her to different people who seemed confused about her accounts. I offered to help clarify the situation, explaining that there had been some transitions in Harold's practice and that Jessica Chen was now handling estate matters. Rebecca seemed relieved to have a family member who understood the legal process, and she asked if I could facilitate a meeting between Vivienne and Jessica. I agreed, of course, knowing that this meeting would be the first step in Vivienne discovering that her world wasn't quite what she thought it was. When I contacted Jessica about scheduling the appointment, she was initially confused. She pulled Vivienne's file and reviewed the recent documents, noting that everything appeared to be current and properly executed. She mentioned that there had been significant changes to the will just a few months earlier, but that all the paperwork was in order and had been processed through the appropriate channels. I explained that Vivienne might not be aware of all the recent updates, given Harold's health situation and the transition period. Jessica scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday afternoon. I made sure to be working late that day, positioning myself where I could observe the conference room without being obvious about it. Vivienne arrived precisely on time, dressed in one of her signature designer suits and carrying the leather briefcase she used for important business meetings. She looked confident and composed, clearly expecting a routine discussion about minor estate adjustments. The meeting started cordially enough. Jessica introduced herself and explained the transition from Harold's practice, assuring Vivienne that all her legal affairs had been handled professionally during the changeover. Vivienne nodded approvingly and began discussing her desire to adjust some of the charitable provisions in her will. She wanted to reduce the amount going to the family foundation and redirect some funds to a new arts organization she'd become involved in. That's when Jessica pulled out the current will and began reviewing the existing provisions with Vivienne. I watched through the glass partition as my aunt's expression gradually changed from confident to confused to something approaching alarm. Jessica was pointing to specific sections of the document, explaining the current distribution of assets. Vivienne was shaking her head, clearly disagreeing with what she was hearing. The conversation became more animated. Vivienne was gesturing emphatically, obviously insisting that the document was incorrect. Jessica remained calm and professional, pulling out additional paperwork to support what she was telling Vivienne. She showed her the codicil that had been filed, the legal notifications that had been processed, and the court records that validated all the changes. I couldn't hear the exact words being exchanged, but I could read Vivienne's body language perfectly. She was discovering that her will now left the vast majority of her fortune to Emma and me, with only a small portion designated for Bradley. The foundation she'd planned to use as her primary legacy was receiving nothing more than a token gesture. Her entire empire planning strategy had been completely reorganized without her knowledge or consent. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. At one point, Vivienne demanded to see Harold Pemberton immediately, insisting that there had been some terrible mistake. Jessica had to gently explain Harold's condition and the fact that he was no longer practicing law. She showed Vivienne the power of substitution provision that had been included in her original estate documents, the very clause that had given me the legal authority to make these changes. When Vivienne finally emerged from the conference room, she looked like she had aged a decade in the span of a single afternoon. Her perfect composure was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen on her face before: genuine uncertainty. She walked past my desk without acknowledging me, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her briefcase. That evening, my phone rang 3 times.
I didn't answer. The next morning, I found 2 voicemails from Vivienne, both of them demanding that I call her immediately to discuss some urgent family matters. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger, and she kept mentioning legal complications that needed to be resolved right away. I deleted both messages and went to work as if nothing had happened. Bradley called me that afternoon, which was unusual since we rarely spoke directly. He said Vivienne had asked him to reach out to me about some confusion regarding estate documents. He sounded nervous, probably because he was beginning to realize that his guaranteed inheritance might not be as guaranteed as he'd thought. I told him I didn't know anything about Vivienne's legal affairs and suggested he speak with her attorney directly. The next few days brought a flurry of activity from Vivienne's camp. Rebecca called twice, asking if I could clarify some family information for legal purposes. Margaret, Vivienne's gossipy friend from the dinner party, sent me a strange Facebook message asking if everything was all right in the family. Even Celeste, Bradley's wife, reached out through Instagram to ask if I'd heard anything about changes to family financial arrangements. I responded to none of them. I had learned from watching Vivienne over the years that silence could be more powerful than any explanation. The more they pressed for answers, the more obvious it became that they were panicking. They were beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted, but they couldn't quite grasp what it was or how it had happened. 2 weeks later, Vivienne showed up at my apartment unannounced. I watched her through the window as she stood outside my building, clearly debating whether to ring the buzzer. She looked smaller somehow, less imposing than she had at her dinner party. When she finally pressed the button for my apartment, I took my time answering. She asked if she could come up to discuss some family business. I buzzed her in and waited by my door as she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my floor. When she reached my landing, she was slightly out of breath, probably not accustomed to walking upstairs in her expensive heels. She looked around at the narrow hallway and peeling paint, clearly uncomfortable in my humble living situation. I invited her in and offered her coffee, which she declined. She sat stiffly on my second-hand couch, surveying my small apartment with obvious distaste. Emma was at school, so we were alone for what I suspected would be a very interesting conversation. Vivienne got straight to the point, explaining that there seemed to be some confusion about her estate planning documents and asking if I knew anything about recent changes. I looked her directly in the eye and told her I wasn't aware of any specific changes, but that estate planning was often complex and that legal documents sometimes contain provisions that weren't immediately obvious to non-lawyers. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if I was being deliberately evasive or genuinely ignorant. Then she asked me point blank if I had anything to do with modifications to her will. I smiled the same sweet smile I'd given her at the dinner party and asked why she would think I'd have any involvement in her legal affairs. I reminded her that she'd made it very clear at her dinner party that I wasn't worthy of her consideration, so it seemed unlikely that I'd be included in important family decisions. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Vivienne becoming increasingly frustrated by my calm responses to her increasingly direct questions. She mentioned the power of substitution provision, asking if I understood what it meant and how it could be used. I admitted that working at a law firm had taught me some things about estate planning, but that I'd never imagined it would be relevant to my own family situation. When she finally left, I could see the wheels turning in her head. She knew something wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put together how I'd managed to outmaneuver her using her own legal system. She also couldn't prove that I'd done anything wrong, since everything had been handled through proper legal channels with legitimate authority. That night, Emma came home with news that made everything even more interesting. She'd run into Bradley at the coffee shop near her school, and he'd seemed unusually stressed. He'd asked her several questions about our financial situation and whether we'd received any unexpected money recently. When she told him we were doing fine, but certainly weren't wealthy, he looked confused and asked if she was sure we hadn't inherited anything lately. Emma thought it was a strange conversation, but she didn't think much of it until she got home and told me about it. I realized that the family was now actively investigating their suspicions, trying to piece together what had happened and how their financial future had been altered. They were finally beginning to understand that the game had changed, but they still didn't know who was playing it or how the rules had been rewritten. The investigation into my involvement intensified over the following months, but it was like watching people search for something in a room where the lights had been turned off. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't see clearly enough to identify the problem or find a solution. Vivienne hired a private investigator, a man named Douglas Hartwell who specialized in financial fraud cases. I knew about him because Rebecca had accidentally mentioned it during one of her calls to our law firm, asking for copies of documents that had already been provided multiple times. Douglas was thorough, I'll give him that. He requested financial records, interviewed family members, and even spoke with some of my coworkers at Morrison Welsh & Associates. Jessica Chen mentioned to me that someone had been asking questions about my access to client files and my involvement in estate planning cases. She seemed mildly concerned, but not suspicious, since everything I'd done had been completely within the scope of my legitimate job responsibilities. The investigator's inquiries actually worked in my favor. The more he dug into the legal proceedings, the more obvious it became that everything had been handled properly. The power of substitution provision was a legitimate part of Vivienne's original estate planning. The codicil had been filed correctly and processed through appropriate channels. Every signature had been properly notarized, every form had been submitted on time, and every legal requirement had been meticulously satisfied. What Douglas couldn't find was any evidence of fraud, forgery, or illegal activity, because there wasn't any. I had used Vivienne's own legal system against her, employing mechanisms that her own attorney had built into her estate planning structure. The irony was delicious. Harold Pemberton had included the power of substitution provision as a safeguard to protect Vivienne's interests, never imagining that it would be used to completely restructure her legacy. Bradley's behavior during this period was particularly entertaining. He'd gone from being casually confident about his inheritance to desperately trying to secure his financial future through other means. He started asking Vivienne for larger monthly allowances, claiming he needed to make some investments before the market changed. He also began hinting that maybe he should be more involved in managing the family finances, offering to help Vivienne organize her accounts and legal documents. Vivienne saw right through his sudden interest and responsibility. During one of their conversations, which Rebecca later described to Jessica during a routine call, Vivienne had accused Bradley of being motivated purely by greed. She told him that if he was so concerned about money, maybe he should try earning some instead of waiting for handouts. The conversation had ended with Bradley storming out of her house, shouting something about ungrateful family members who didn't appreciate loyalty. Emma, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the family drama unfolding around us.
She was focused on her nursing school clinical rotations and her plans for after graduation. She'd been accepted into a graduate program that would allow her to specialize in pediatric care, something she dreamed about since childhood. The program was expensive, though, and she'd been worrying about student loans and living expenses. I told her not to stress about money, that things had a way of working out when you least expected them to. 6 months after Vivienne's visit to my apartment, I received news that changed everything.
Jessica Chen called me at work to inform me that Vivienne had suffered a massive stroke while vacationing at her Martha's Vineyard property. She'd been found by her housekeeper and rushed to the hospital, but the damage was extensive. She was alive, but incapacitated, unable to speak or make decisions for herself. Bradley immediately petitioned the court to be appointed as his mother's guardian, which would have given him control over her medical care and financial affairs. However, Vivienne had prepared for this possibility years earlier by designating a professional guardian service to handle such situations. The irony was that Harold Pemberton had recommended this arrangement, probably because he'd witnessed too many family disputes over guardianship issues with his wealthy clients. The guardian service took over Vivienne's care and began managing her day-to-day affairs according to the instructions she'd left in her advance directives. Bradley was furious, claiming that family should take precedence over hired strangers. He hired his own attorney to challenge the guardianship arrangement, but the legal documents were ironclad. Vivienne had been very specific about her wishes regarding incapacitation scenarios. For 3 months, Vivienne lingered in a high-end rehabilitation facility, receiving the best medical care money could buy, but showing no signs of improvement. The doctors explained that her cognitive function had been severely compromised and that recovery was unlikely. Bradley visited regularly, probably hoping she'd miraculously recover enough to change her will back to his favor. I visited once, bringing flowers and sitting quietly by her bedside for 30 minutes. She stared at me with eyes that seemed to recognize something but couldn't quite place what it was. When Vivienne passed away on a Tuesday morning in November, I was at work processing routine legal documents. Jessica Chen called me within an hour of the death to express her condolences and to let me know that the will would be read the following week. She mentioned that it was a large estate with multiple beneficiaries, so the proceedings might be more complex than usual. I thanked her for the call and went back to my filing duties as if nothing had changed. The will reading took place at Morrison, Walsh & Associates on a gray Thursday afternoon. Bradley arrived with Celeste and his attorney, clearly expecting to finally claim his inheritance. Margaret and Dorothy were there as executors of the charitable provisions. A few other distant relatives attended, probably hoping for small bequests that might pay for vacation trips or home improvements. I arrived exactly on time, wearing the same type of simple black dress that Vivienne had once mocked at her dinner party. Emma came with me, confused about why we'd been included in such an important family proceeding. She whispered that she hoped Vivienne had left us something meaningful, maybe some jewelry or photographs that would help us remember the good times we'd shared as a family. Jessica Chen conducted the reading with professional efficiency, starting with the smaller bequests to household staff and distant relatives. Bradley shifted impatiently in his chair, clearly eager to get to the main event. When Jessica reached the major provisions of the will, the room fell completely silent. She explained that the estate was valued at approximately $43 million, including real estate, investments, and personal property. Then she began reading the specific distributions. Bradley would receive a trust fund of $2 million, distributed over 10 years to ensure responsible management. The family foundation would receive $1 million to continue its charitable work. Various smaller bequests would go to longtime employees and a few charitable organizations that had been meaningful to Vivienne. The remaining $40 million, Jessica announced, would be divided equally between Emma and me as the primary beneficiaries of the estate. The room erupted. Bradley shot to his feet, demanding to see the documents. His attorney was already pulling out his phone, probably calling colleagues to discuss legal challenges. Margaret and Dorothy looked at each other in complete bewilderment, clearly trying to process how two people they'd barely acknowledged could suddenly become the wealthiest members of the family. Emma grabbed my arm and whispered that there had to be some mistake. She couldn't understand why Vivienne would leave us anything substantial, given how she'd always treated us as the poor relations. I squeezed her hand and told her that sometimes people surprised you, even after they were gone. Bradley's attorney immediately began questioning the validity of the will, demanding to know when it had been modified and who had authorized the changes. Jessica calmly produced all the documentation, including the original power of substitution provision and the properly executed codicil that had restructured the estate. She explained that everything had been handled according to Massachusetts estate law and that all documents had been filed with the appropriate courts months earlier. The legal challenge that followed was swift and decisive. Bradley hired 3 different law firms to contest the will, claiming that Vivienne had been mentally incompetent when the changes were made, and that someone had manipulated her into altering her true intentions. The problem with his argument was that Vivienne had been traveling in Europe when the codicil was filed, completely unaware that any changes were being made to her estate planning documents. Douglas Hartwell, the private investigator, provided a detailed report showing that the modifications had been made using legitimate legal authority during a period when Vivienne was mentally sharp and physically healthy. The power of substitution provision had been included in her original estate documents at her own request based on Harold Pemberton's recommendation that wealthy clients should have safeguards in place for unexpected circumstances. The legal trial lasted 8 months, during which time the estate remained frozen while lawyers argued about legal technicalities and procedural requirements. Bradley spent a fortune on legal fees, probably using up a significant portion of the $2 million he was still set to inherit. His marriage to Celeste didn't survive the stress and uncertainty, ending in a divorce that left him with even fewer assets than he'd started with. When the judge finally ruled in favor of the will's validity, Bradley made one last desperate attempt to reconcile with Emma and me. He called and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss the family situation and how we might move forward together. He suggested that maybe we could find a way to share the inheritance more equitably, since Vivienne had obviously not been thinking clearly when she made such dramatic changes to her estate planning. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He looked exhausted and defeated, clearly struggling to accept that his guaranteed future of luxury and leisure had evaporated. He talked about family loyalty and the importance of taking care of each other, conveniently forgetting 15 years of condescension and dismissive treatment. He said he didn't understand how things had gotten so complicated, that the will changes didn't make sense based on Vivienne's true feelings about the family. I listened patiently to his entire speech, then looked him directly in the eye and asked him if he remembered what Vivienne had said to me at her dinner party. His expression shifted as the memory came back to him. I reminded him of her exact words about how I would get nothing when she died, how pity was the only reason the family included me in anything. Then I smiled the same smile I'd given her that night, and told him that sometimes life has a funny way of surprising people. I explained that Vivienne had been absolutely right about one thing. Pity had indeed gone a long way, just not in the direction she had expected. Her pity for me had blinded her to the fact that I was intelligent enough to understand her own legal system and resourceful enough to use it for my own purposes. Bradley stared at me for a long moment, finally understanding that I had orchestrated everything from the beginning.
He asked how long I'd been planning it, and I told him the truth. I'd never planned any of it until Harold Pemberton's dementia created an opportunity that was too perfect to ignore. Sometimes the universe just handed you exactly what you needed at precisely the right moment. Emma used her share of the inheritance to attend medical school and establish a free clinic in our old neighborhood. I bought a beautiful house overlooking the harbor and invested the rest of the money in a portfolio that generates enough income to support several charitable organizations that actually help people instead of just making wealthy donors feel good about themselves. I still work at Morrison, Walsh & Associates, partly because I enjoy the legal work and partly because it amuses me to process documents for wealthy clients who have no idea that their poor paralegal could buy and sell most of them. Jessica Chen was promoted to partner last year, and she occasionally asks for my assistance on complex estate planning cases. I always provide excellent service, making sure that every legal document is properly executed and every client's wishes are clearly documented. Sometimes I drive past Vivienne's old mansion, which Bradley had to sell to pay his legal bills and divorce settlement. The new owners have turned it into a boutique hotel, which seems fitting somehow. People pay hundreds of dollars a night to sleep in rooms where my aunt once held court over her empire of condescension and cruelty. I never told Emma the full truth about how I'd changed Vivienne's will. She believes that our aunt had a change of heart in her final years, perhaps realizing that Bradley was too irresponsible to handle such wealth, and that we deserved recognition for the way we'd quietly supported each other through difficult times. It's a more generous interpretation than the reality, but Emma has always preferred to see the best in people. The truth is simpler and more satisfying. Vivienne spent her entire life using money as a weapon to control and diminish the people around her. She never imagined that someone she considered weak and powerless could turn that same weapon against her, using nothing more than patience, knowledge, and her own legal system. In the end, her arrogance and cruelty created the perfect conditions for her own downfall. Bradley eventually moved to Florida and started selling real estate, probably hoping to rebuild his fortune through commission sales. We exchange Christmas cards each year, maintaining the appearance of family connection without any real substance behind it. He never mentions the inheritance or asks about our lives, and I never volunteer information about how we're using Vivienne's money to actually make a difference in the world. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it's quiet and methodical, delivered through legal documents and court proceedings rather than dramatic confrontations. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, while the people who tried to diminish you discover that they underestimated your intelligence and overestimated their own importance. Every morning when I wake up in my beautiful house and look out at the harbor, I remember that dinner party where Vivienne told me I'd get nothing when she died. She was wrong about that, just like she was wrong about so many other things. I got everything, and more importantly, I got the last laugh. 5 years have passed since Vivienne's death, and the world has settled into a rhythm I never could have imagined during those years of enduring her cruelty. Emma graduated from medical school with honors and now runs 3 free clinics that serve families who can't afford traditional healthcare. Her work has been featured in medical journals, and she's become a respected voice in community health advocacy. She still doesn't know the full story of how our fortune came to be, and I've decided she never needs to. My own life has taken directions I never expected. The house by the harbor has become a gathering place for local writers and artists, people who create beautiful things despite having limited resources. I established a foundation that provides grants to talented individuals who need financial support to pursue their dreams. Unlike Vivienne's performative charity work, this foundation operates quietly, changing lives without demanding recognition or gratitude. Last month, I received a letter from Bradley's daughter, a young woman I'd never met who somehow tracked down my address. She wrote that her father had told her stories about our family's complicated history, and she wanted to apologize for the way Emma and I had been treated over the years. She's studying social work and hopes to dedicate her career to helping families resolve conflicts before they become destructive. I wrote back, telling her that the past was settled, but that I admired her commitment to making the future better. The legal profession has been good to me. Jessica Chen and I have become genuine friends, and she's encouraged me to consider law school. I've been accepted to several programs, though I haven't decided whether to pursue that path. There's something appealing about the idea of representing people who've been underestimated by those in power, using the same legal system that once served me so well to help others find their own form of justice. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Vivienne had simply treated Emma and me with basic human decency. If she'd included us in family gatherings without making us feel like charity cases. If she'd acknowledged our struggles without turning them into entertainment for her friends. If she'd used her wealth to actually help the people she claimed to care about, instead of wielding it as a tool for control and humiliation. But then I remember that her cruelty is what taught me to be strong. Her dismissiveness showed me the value of underestimating quiet people. Her arrogance revealed the weaknesses that could be exploited by someone patient enough to study the system and smart enough to use it effectively. In a strange way, she created the very person who would ultimately inherit everything she'd worked so hard to build. The mansion that once hosted those terrible dinner parties has been converted into affordable housing for seniors. The yacht Bradley never got to buy sits in someone else's marina. The designer clothes and expensive jewelry have been donated to organizations that auction them to fund domestic violence shelters. Even in death, Vivienne's possessions are finally serving a purpose that might actually help people. I kept only one thing from her estate, a small crystal paperweight from her desk, etched with the words, "Success is the best revenge." She probably bought it as a motivational reminder of her philosophy, never imagining that someday it would sit on the desk of the niece she'd dismissed as worthless. Every morning when I see it, I'm reminded that success isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's as quiet as a smile at a dinner party, as patient as filing legal documents, as simple as outlasting the people who tried to diminish you. The truth is, I won more than just money when I changed Vivienne's will. I won my freedom from a family that had never valued me, my independence from people who saw me only as a source of labor and loyalty, and my power to create the kind of life I'd always wanted but never thought possible. Most importantly, I proved to myself that intelligence and determination could overcome years of systematic cruelty. There are no regrets, no second thoughts about the path I chose. Vivienne made her intentions clear that night at dinner, and I simply made sure her legacy reflected different values than the ones she'd lived by. The $40 million was never really about the money. It was justice, dignity, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the quiet person in the corner is the most dangerous one in the room. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.